This is a Hog Sports Network podcast.
We're getting close to Arkansas's first game against a Power 5 team this year. The Razorbacks play BYU on Saturday night at Razorback Stadium in Fayetteville. It's a 6:30 kickoff, and the game will be televised by ESPN2. Kind of interesting, BYU was an independent when these teams played last year, was an independent when the series was contracted, but now they're in the Big 12, first year for the Cougars in that conference. Big opportunity for the Big 12 to get more wins on SEC fields this week. Of course, Texas beat Alabama last week. You've got BYU coming to Arkansas. You've got Kansas State going to Missouri. That's one of the storylines going into college football this weekend. I'm Matt Jones with Scotty Bordelon and Ethan Westerman. And Scotty, as we look back at the game last year between Arkansas and BYU, I don't know how much you can take away from that game because so many things have changed for these two teams. They both went out and kind of overhauled their rosters through the transfer portal. Rocket Sanders had a big game against BYU last year in Provo. He's not going to play in this game. BYU's got a different quarterback. Maybe the constants are the logos, the coaches, and KJ Jefferson.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, we just published our keys to the game, and I think my top key anyway was, just let KJ be KJ. And yeah, he is one of the constants from last year's game. Obviously, I kind of forgot the kind of offensive day that Arkansas had at BYU. Obviously, I think that was the game that Rocket went over 1,000 yards for the season, if I'm remembering that right.
It would have been in that time frame. Yeah, it was mid-October.
Yeah, he had a really good day that day, but KJ also threw for over 350 yards and 5 touchdowns in that game. So he's got some prior success, obviously, against BYU. And I think this is just the week that Arkansas kind of cuts him loose, like I said, on Tuesday. And Sam Pittman basically said as much on Wednesday. They've got to do whatever they've got to do to win games. And I think that's, going to look like KJ. Obviously, he's going to touch the ball on every offensive play, unless Arkansas does a tight end sneak again or something like that. Yeah, I think it's a game that that KJ is going to be very well in control of, and it'll be interesting to see kind of if does BYU kind of go to the four corners deal again and kind of play ball possession and keep away from KJ. That's going to be interesting to track because these games are not as long as they used to be with the new clock rules and stuff. I think last week's game went 2:45, which is crazy. I was talking to my wife about it the other day. I said it only lasted, about 30 minutes longer than a college basketball game does, which is pretty crazy. But I think it's a week Arkansas can, maybe try to get some things figured out offensively. And I think we see the full KJ Jefferson that maybe we didn't get to see the first couple weeks.
And that's 2:45 with commercial breaks still. And I don't know what it was for the game against Kent State. I know that when Arkansas played some of their games last year, I counted up how long the commercial breaks were taking. And it was somewhere on average of about 40 to 45 minutes a game that commercials were taking. And so you're talking about you throw in halftime, 20-minute halftime in there, and it's only like an hour and 45 minutes of real football that's getting played between Arkansas and Kent State the other day. That's pretty wild. You mentioned Arkansas's game last year in Provo. The Razorbacks had 644 yards of offense in that game. It was one of the top 10 offensive performances in school history. And even though Arkansas won by 17, I felt like they outplayed BYU by a margin greater than 17 points. A lot of people probably forget that end of the game, Arkansas goes on a 10-minute and 2-second drive that goes to the BYU 1-yard line. And instead of, it's not to say that they weren't trying to score, but I don't think they were trying hard to score there at the end. They didn't want to run it up. They didn't want to, maybe give BYU an added motivation going into this year's game. And so they didn't score on a 4th and goal from the 1-yard line. BYU gets possession, takes one snap, and the game's over. It was a thorough performance for Arkansas offensively last year at BYU. And I think the thing that kind of surprised me in that game was that Kalani Sitake, who is BYU's longtime coach, really prides himself on a physical bunch. And they've been physical in games, but I thought Arkansas's physicality really overtook BYU in that game last year. It was kind of eye-opening to me because I thought maybe they would be more on par with one another. But hey, I guess that's sometimes that's what playing in the SEC will do for you, especially by mid-October. Arkansas was just a lot more physical than BYU was. Ethan, you've watched some of their games this year, and I know you've looked into this roster quite a bit. What do you expect from BYU?
Yeah, it's kind of funny. They're in a weird way kind of in a similar spot as Arkansas right now that they haven't really played great competition. I know Sam Pittman was really he was quick to praise Sam Houston, thinking that that's a good team that they played, but
Hmm.
still it's one of those type of deals where they're you know, this is really just the first big test for both teams, but they have a similar problem right now that they haven't really been able to run the ball at all. Um, they've both teams have had some success finding some playmakers in the passing game. The tight end for BYU, Isaac Rex, he had like 112-yard game against Southern Utah last time out. They have some receivers that they got in the portal, just like Arkansas, in Darius Lassiter and a few others. So they have some playmakers that they've discovered in the portal, and it just seems like they're kind of in the same boat as Arkansas, trying to get that chemistry offensively. Um, but both teams also have felt really good about how the way their defense has played through 2 weeks. BYU, I mean, if it wasn't for that defensive performance in week one against Sam Houston, they shut them out 14-0. 14 points isn't as much as you're wanting to score against a team like Sam Houston. So their defense, they really kind of rallied behind them in that game. And then against Southern Utah, they allowed 16 points. So both teams, it's kind of right now. I think you say this every year early in the year, but it's kind of more questions than answers, and you're just kind of waiting for that first big test. So I think it'll be interesting to see you reference that game Arkansas at BYU last year. Arkansas was able to get 277 yards through the ground against BYU. AJ Green, who we expect to be Arkansas's main tailback for this game, he had 51 yards in that game. So he's had a little bit of success against them. 51 yards on 11 carries isn't bad. Rocket Sanders, though, in that game, he had, I think at the time, that was his career high in rushing yards. He had 175 against them last year, and then top to that against Ole Miss later in the year. But Arkansas had success running the ball against them last year. So it'll be interesting to see if maybe this is the week that Arkansas can get back to the run game that Sam Pittman really likes. But two teams that look oddly similar, but at the same time, this might be a good litmus test to see where both teams are at.
I did look this up after we were talking about this the other day. Sam Houston did win the FCS National Championship in 2020. I said I thought they did. They did. So that's a team that's, even though they're FBS, this is their first year in FBS. They're not far removed from FCS. I don't know that, to Ethan's point, neither of these teams have played very good competition. BYU had played two teams that were in the FCS last year. Southern Utah still in the FCS. Caden Slovis is their quarterback, and he transferred in from Pitt. Of course, began his career at Southern Cal. He's put up decent numbers so far. Has not been sacked, but one of the things, Scotty, that stood out to me that I think could be a real key to this game is that Southern Utah pressured him 9 times last week, and that seems like a really high number for an FCS team against an FBS offensive line. And when you think about the type of game that Arkansas's defensive front is coming off of, 7 sacks, 11 tackles for loss, not all of that was the defensive line, but those were the total numbers for Arkansas's defense, and the line contributed a lot of that. When you think about that type of performance that they had last week against Kent State, and you see that Southern Utah was able to put that kind of pressure on Slovis, that's interesting to me this week.
Yeah, same here. And I reference Pro Football Focus a lot because I trust their metrics. I think something that's going to be interesting in this game is Arkansas's run game against BYU's run defense. I think they've got the 12th best run defense grade among FBS teams. But if you look at BYU's pass blocking numbers, it's 68.5 through a couple of games. Not exactly sure where that stacks up nationally, but you would obviously wish that if you're BYU that those pass blocking numbers were a lot better. I mean, Arkansas's after 2 weeks, even though the offensive line and tight ends and whoever have been kind of getting some flack for their blocking, like Arkansas's pass blocking numbers are over 80 and BYU sitting at 68.5. So yeah, they haven't obviously been clean, and this is not based on what Arkansas's front has done on the defensive side the first couple of weeks. It's not probably going to be a really big challenge for BYU. I mean, Arkansas, they feel pretty confident rolling in gosh, what, upwards of like 8, 9 guys. I think they have their top 4 pretty set, but and I think we'll see. I think this is the week, that we'll probably see Arkansas play its guys more instead of like the first series. Your top 4 guys roll out there. The second series, your second group rolls out there. I think we could see maybe some guys staying on the field pretty consistently, because I would imagine that they're seeing those pressure numbers that BYU's given up the first couple of weeks against kind of inferior competition. And Arkansas obviously would like to think that they've got guys that are more talented, more athletic, more powerful, that can wreak a little bit of havoc on that BYU offensive line. So yeah, I wonder if this is going to be a week where we can kind of maybe see that both of these teams have played against teams that are a little bit below their usual competition level. Maybe have to shake the cobwebs off a little bit and just kind of get used to the maybe the uptick in competition. So I wouldn't be shocked, honestly, if there's a little bit of sloppiness on both sides, especially offensively. As maybe both of these teams try to settle in a little bit.
And on the other side, Ethan, BYU has not put a lot of pressure on opposing quarterbacks, just 1 sack through 2 games.
Yeah, they it's kind of funny. I'm going to go back real quick before I touch on that. You talked about how their offensive line, how they haven't been great pass blocking, but they're one of 7 teams that haven't allowed a sack yet. So it's one of those deals, I think, where that grade is more just referencing that Slovis has had a lot of pressure on him, and he's having to maybe dump the ball off quicker than he wants, not being able to even get through his progression, having to throw it away. But I just find it interesting to see that, I expected, seeing their pass blocking grade, that they'd taken some sacks by now. But yeah, that was just touching back on that point about their offensive line. But yeah, their defense, they're one of these defenses that they're hard to predict. I feel like they run a ton of different looks at you. They're very multiple, I think, there is the way that Sam Pittman referenced it. They have a lot of really strong linebacker play. They have a guy, Ben Bywater, who I think he was preseason All Big 12. They have a guy that Sam Pittman loves, Max Tooley. They have a lot of playmakers, but they really haven't gotten after the quarterback very much this year. So it's one of those type of deals. You almost wonder if this is the type of game that Arkansas can, if able to buy KJ Jefferson some time and get some playmakers, out on the edges, if they can maybe bust a few big plays. But this is a defense for BYU that I think, similar to Arkansas, it's just a lot of new faces right now, and it's a lot of just seeing how these guys can maybe step up in games like this and see if you can maybe pinpoint some playmakers. I feel like it's kind of these bigger games, your first marquee non-conference game, where you see who are kind of your guys, who are your guys that are going to step up and come up with a sack in a big situation.
Speaking of playmakers, there's been a lot of talk around Arkansas this week, not necessarily within the program, but I've just seen it on message boards, heard it elsewhere, about Isaiah Satania and the maybe the lack of snaps that he's had, Scotty. It was interesting to listen to Pittman, talk about that on Monday. He said one of the things that happened against Kent State was that when they got into, the pattern of running the ball late in the game, that Satania he didn't factor into those plans. And I think part of it is that he's not as strong of a run blocker. And you look at his numbers in game 1, PFF stats, they weren't very strong. He was about 50-50 run and pass during that game. And I thought it was kind of interesting that when they played Kent State, he was on the field 3 times as many snaps in passing downs than he was in running downs. And so it's interesting to see what they're going to do with him, because, we talk about getting playmakers involved. What we've seen from him, whether it be in spring practice or elsewhere, we know he's a playmaker, or he's certainly got that capability. And it's going to be interesting to see what they do with him this week against BYU.
Yeah, man, I'm with you. And I think I've talked about this with Tom before. It's like in the preseason, and like you mentioned too, going back to the spring, the guys that were making plays in practice when we were watching, it was Isaac Tesla, Andrew Armstrong, and Isaiah Satania. And I came into the season thinking that Satania was going to be like their solidly like their number 3 guy.
Mm-hmm.
And it just hasn't, I don't know what, for whatever reason, it just hasn't worked out that way to this point. and it seems like there's a lot of trust in Jaden Wilson. And granted, Jaden had a really good opener. Obviously, the touchdown on the second play of the year was a big deal for him.
Mhm.
But outside of that, man, there hasn't just been a whole lot of success when you're targeting Jaden. Like remember there was a third down drop last week that he had, could have extended a drive, in a game that at that time was, pretty close. Anytime you can convert on third down in a tight game, um, that's a big deal. And he didn't come up with it. But there seems like there's a lot of trust in him. But I think that Satania's your third guy. I just think you got to find ways to get him the ball, whether it's like jet sweeps or maybe you throw him a tunnel screen and just kind of try to get him out in space, put a defender on an island and let him try to beat him one-on-one because he's got enough shiftiness and elusiveness to, make something out of that. Yeah, I'm hope maybe this is the week that they get him involved. Going back to what Ethan was talking about with BYU having one sack. They're one of 9 teams in the country right now that only have one. Interestingly enough, LSU is another one of those, and so is Georgia, which might be the most shocking thing I just looked at.
Yeah.
But I think you're going to see plenty of passing from KJ, and I would be surprised if Isaiah's not factored in there somewhere, man. Like even if you don't throw in bubbles or tunnels or something like that, jet sweeps, let him stretch his legs and maybe try to take the top off of a defense for a quick strike score. I just think he's too valuable, he's too fast, he's too talented to not be as a factor. And he just hasn't been these first 2 weeks. It's been kind of head scratching to me because I think he's, to me anyway, and I'm not trying to put Jaden Wilson down, but I think Isaiah, I think he's your better option there.
And you wonder every week going into every game with Satania, is he going to break one in the special teams? He came awfully close to breaking one or two times against Western Carolina. Had a decent return last week against Kent State. Pittman said he is a willing blocker. He's just not physically there. And I don't think that's really that surprising when you look at his size. You think about the fact that he's a sprinter. He's not going to be that big, strong wide receiver that you might see at other places on the field. But yeah, I mean, and it's not just running game either. Remember that these receivers are asked to do a lot in the passing game as well from a blocking perspective. So certainly going to be interesting to see how Isaiah Satania factors into this. And one more note on special teams, kind of surprising that Cam Little has not kicked a field goal yet this year, not even attempted one. Was really good during the preseason. In a game where you think it might be a little bit closer, that kicking game can certainly come into play. The Whole Hog Football Podcast is sponsored by Kendall King Design, Displays, Signage, KendallKing.com. That's KendallKing.com.
The Kendall King Group family of companies plays to win, just like our hogs. We know how demanding retail marketing is today. From digital omni-channel creative services, through in-store signing and displays, and finally to social influence, we've got you covered. Our KKG Inc. family of companies, Kendall King, Shopcart Creative, and Soapbox Influence are winning with multiple retailers and brands. We play to win and will be a winning partner for all your retail marketing service needs. Go Hogs!
When BYU comes to town, it's going to be kind of interesting because the expectation is BYU is going to bring a pretty large fan base to Fayetteville. I don't know that might be as well known that they travel so well, but you think about BYU kind of in the way you think about Notre Dame. Notre Dame has the affiliation with the Catholic Church. And so, when Notre Dame goes to these different towns, you get a certain group of people who may not have had an opportunity to see Notre Dame in person. It's the same way with the Church of Latter-day Saints. Big BYU following here in Northwest Arkansas. They're expecting a big BYU crowd this weekend in Fayetteville. Certainly going to be home field advantage for Arkansas. I'm not saying that you're going to have 20,000 BYU fans in there, but they do expect BYU to have a big following here in Fayetteville, Scotty, and maybe the biggest following of any team coming to Fayetteville this year. When you look at tickets on the secondary market, the tickets for BYU are more expensive than any other game in Fayetteville this year. It's all based on dynamic pricing. And I think it comes down to the fact that there are a lot of people who want to come to the Arkansas-BYU game. And you get a team like Auburn, Mississippi State coming to Fayetteville. You've seen that one before. This is a unique matchup.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, you look at the other schools that are coming in here the rest of the year. It's Mississippi State and Auburn and Missouri. Missouri will be easy to travel to, and I think Auburn are obviously. I think there's enough of a kind of a hatred there, and Auburn fans probably obviously think that they can come. They're going to come in here and win, so they're probably going to travel all right too. But yeah, it should be interesting. I think it'll be a fun atmosphere just in general. Like I know I'm as excited to cover this game as I have been. Obviously, for the first two games, it's a night game. Um, no BYU fans probably not going to partake in what Arkansas fans are going to throughout the day, but as long as the weather's fine, I think they'll they'll probably enjoy their day up here. Um, yeah, I'm looking forward to it. I think anytime you get a night game, the first night game of the year is always really fun, I think, and everybody will look forward to that one. And I can remember talking to Sam Pittman in Destin at SEC spring meetings, and he was really excited about this game, even back in late May, early
Mm-hmm.
June. Like I think he likes it when Arkansas's fans show up, pack the stadium out, and they're loud and rowdy. I think he's seen what kind of a home field advantage they can have, when the fan base is engaged and a good opponent's in town. I mean, I think that has a lot to do with the build up too. That it's not just kind of a throwaway game at home.
You mentioned BYU doesn't tailgate like everybody else. I actually got an email from someone at BYU this week. They said, but it's not beer and brats with us. One of the things they do is they gather items that are needed in food banks and in other, areas that help, you know, less fortunate individuals. They're going to donate 40,000 pounds of food to a local food bank here in Fayetteville before the game. It's kind of an incredible gesture. Around the SEC now, some games this week to watch. Of course, we'll talk about Arkansas-BYU last, but the first game of the day, actually a couple of 11 o'clock kickoffs. The first one is LSU at Mississippi State. It'll be on ESPN. LSU bounced back big with a big victory over Grambling last week, 72-10. Mississippi State beat Arizona in overtime. This is going to be in Starkville. LSU's got its chance at its first win over an FBS team.
Man, I really don't know what to make of that game. With the game being in Starkville, I think it'll be pretty competitive. If I'm being honest, I think I saw the line earlier was like maybe 10 or 10 and a half. I think Mississippi State could cover that. I wouldn't be absolutely shocked. I don't think if Mississippi State won it. Um, but I think you said that game's at 11 o'clock, right? I
Mm-hmm.
think I think that's like Sam Pittman said earlier this week. I think that's the perfect time to play a game on the road. You know what I mean? So
Mm-hmm.
I think LSU will win. But I think Mississippi State will cover. I think it'll be a pretty competitive game to the end.
Yeah, I'm with you, Scotty, that I think this one's going to be close, and I would be more than willing to pick Mississippi State if it was the same air raid look as last year, because LSU's secondary through 2 weeks has been really bad. They're near the bottom in almost every category of pass defense in the nation. But Mississippi State this year is kind of predicated on its run game, which is just it's taking a little bit of adjusting. I think that LSU, um, like you said, with that being an 11 a.m. game, that's kind of ideal for an early season road game. I feel like I just think that they'll maybe if Mississippi State had have beaten Arizona a little more convincingly, I'd go out on a limb and pick them. But I think LSU will win.
Keep in mind, LSU can still, they're like Alabama. It's just a non-conference loss that they have. They've still got everything that, you know, everything ahead of them, quite honestly. I mean, they could win the SEC West. They could maybe win the SEC and get into the playoff that way. Still a lot to play for LSU. Mississippi State still has the air raid. They don't have Mike Leach. I think that's a huge component when you talk about their passing game. I think LSU goes to Mississippi State and wins. The other 11 o'clock game, Kansas State goes to Missouri. It's an old Big 8, Big 12 matchup. It'll be on SEC Network. Missouri skinned by Middle Tennessee State last week. Kansas State looks pretty good, ranked 15th in the AP poll.
Yeah, I think it was last year we were in a post game press conference for an Arkansas home game, and I think Missouri scored like a touchdown with like no time left on the clock in that game. I'm not saying that it's going to be like a blowout and, Missouri maybe gets another score late like they did last year, but I like Kansas State. I think that team's pretty talented. And I'm just like I don't know, maybe it's me, but I'm not completely sold on Eli Drinkwitz either.
I'm with you there. I think that it's kind of funny though, looking at the landscape of college football this week, this actually might be kind of the best game of the week. I don't know if it's fair to call it that, but I do think that Missouri still has quite a long ways to go. I watched the end of that game against Middle Tennessee, and I'm just not sold on them at all. So I'll pick Kansas.
Yeah, when both of the pregame shows go to Colorado State, Colorado, it tells you about the quality of games across the country. I'm with you guys. I don't trust Missouri. I think Kansas State is a really solid program. I think they'll go in and to Columbia and win that game this week and give the Big 12 a 2-0 record against the SEC. And that'll put some eyes on Arkansas-BYU on Saturday night. Some games we won't pick, just real quick. Louisiana Monroe goes to Texas A&M. Samford is at Auburn. Vanderbilt's at UNLV, kind of an interesting matchup. You've got the Arkansas tie-in there with Barry Odom, now the head coach at UNLV. Wouldn't even know how to begin to pick that one if I had to. And then Akron goes to Kentucky. 2:30 kickoff on CBS. South Carolina is at Georgia. I always think this is one of the great underrated rivalries in the SEC, but South Carolina, they got some splaining to do, so to speak. They lost to North Carolina 2 weeks ago. Didn't look real dominant against Furman last week, and they played Georgia, who just always looks mad.
Yeah, Georgia fans probably are mad the way their offense is getting off to a slow start. I think the last couple Saturdays, when we've been in the press box just kind of score watching when we're able to, it's been a little bit surprising to see Georgia kind of scuffling out of the gates a little bit, but their defense is still really good, man. And I think for a lot of teams, like I mentioned earlier, Georgia's one of those teams that got one sack in this season through 2 games. That's totally not what Georgia's defense has been in the past. Maybe they'll be able to get home this week, but even if they're not, I would be willing to bet that Spencer Rattler might offer up a pick or two.
Yeah, I saw enough of South Carolina against North Carolina to think that Georgia's defense is probably going to have a field day against them. Just that offensive line for South Carolina has a really long ways to go. Just getting Spencer Rattler even time to try and make a play. Georgia hasn't really gotten after the quarterback, like you said, this year, but they still have one of the best defenses in the country. I think they're near the top in most every defensive team category as far as like yards and scoring and all that goes right now. So I'm not sure. I think the line for that game is like 4 touchdowns or something. I'm not sure it'll be that bad, but I think Georgia beats them by at least a couple scores.
The last 3 games in this series, 45-16, 40-13, 48-7 last year in Columbia. Georgia had cleared that stadium out by the end of the third quarter. They beat South Carolina so thoroughly last year. I think that they beat South Carolina big again. And maybe the only thing to watch in that game is who Shane Beamer blames the loss on. It was the chain gang that he blamed the loss on 2 weeks ago against North Carolina. Alabama goes to South Florida, kind of an interesting game, 2:30 kickoff on ABC. Of course, the Crimson Tide really mad after what happened against Texas. And I'm going to own my pick last week. I said I thought Texas would lose by multiple scores at Alabama. Wow, they looked really impressive. But I figure Alabama goes to South Florida and wins this pretty handily.
Yeah, you probably weren't the only one. I think I was also in that same boat with you last week. That was watching Alabama lose at home by double figures is one of the crazier things that I've seen since I've been covering college football a little bit. That was absolutely wild. But yeah, I do think Alabama, maybe that game just serves as like a time to refocus now. You know what I mean? I don't think Jalen Milroe was necessarily bad last week. It's just, man, if it could go wrong, it did go wrong for Alabama. This might be a get back week for Alabama, and maybe South Florida competes a little bit. I think the coach at South Florida helped the team last year put up a bunch of points on Alabama. So maybe there's some familiarity there, but I think Alabama's depth will be too much.
Yeah, I think that Alabama's gonna be out to definitely prove something this week. I see this one being really, really ugly. South Florida lost to Western Kentucky in their opener by I think 2 or 3 scores. And then, yeah, I just don't think Alabama's going to respond from that Texas game by being flat. I think they're going to probably play pretty angry.
Alex Golesh is the head coach at South Florida. He was the offensive coordinator at Tennessee last year. Alabama wins that one big, I think, on Saturday. Speaking of Tennessee, they go to Florida. It's a 6 o'clock kickoff on ESPN in the Swamp. Florida, we know the problems they had with Utah 2 weeks ago. Tennessee did not look real great against Austin Peay last week.
No, I think I'm still riding with Jalen Milroe or Joe Milton at this point. Sorry. I just really like him. I think he's super talented. And I don't think Tennessee's won in the Swamp in 20 years, something like that.
Has it been that long?
It's been a long time. I could have misread the internet. But I'm pretty sure they haven't won there in a long, long time. But I like Tennessee though. I really like their skill talent, and I think Billy Napier's another one of those guys in the league that, he might be. I know it's early in his tenure. He could be coaching for his job pretty soon. I think Tennessee's too talented. I think they'll win down there.
All preseason, Florida was that team in the SEC that I kind of picked. Like I said, last or second to last in the East. I just didn't have much faith in them, but for some reason I do this week. I just think that it sets up like such a game for them. I don't really think that they're playing with as much pressure maybe as Tennessee in this game, with it just being a home game in the Swamp. They've already taken a loss this year. Their defense, is actually playing really, really well. They're third in the country in total defense right now. I just think that kind of the way that this game sets up, and had Tennessee blown out Austin Peay last week, I probably wouldn't be going on a limb and picking Florida up to upset them. But that game just didn't show me anything. Austin Peay's not very good. And Tennessee did not look very sharp. So I think that it kind of just sets up for one of those weird upsets. I'm picking Florida.
2003, that was the last time that Tennessee beat Florida in the Swamp. In fact, last year when Tennessee won, Florida had won 16 of the previous 17 meetings in that series. I'm going with Tennessee because I don't think Florida can score. I think Tennessee, even in a low-scoring game, Tennessee is going to have the upper hand because it's just a little bit better offensively, maybe a lot better offensively, quite frankly, than Florida. One other game before we get to Arkansas-BYU. It kicks off at the same time, 6:30 on SEC Network. Georgia Tech goes to Ole Miss. If memory serves, Ole Miss went to Atlanta and hammered Georgia Tech last year.
Yeah, I'm just going to stick with Ole Miss. I think their offense is a little bit too powerful right now. I was trying to find some stats on Ole Miss from last week. They put up 37 points against Tulane. I think that game last week against Tulane. I kind of in the back of my mind was like, man, that could be a trap game for Ole Miss. If they don't go in there laser focused, but to come out of there with a 17-point win, I mean, they're coming back home, right? It's not a neutral field game.
No, it's in Oxford.
Yeah, I like Ole Miss in that game. And I think this is a week that they need to get sharp because they're going to have to go to Alabama next weekend.
Yeah, I like Ole Miss to win this one pretty big. And I think that this is the game that Quinshon Judkins really gets going because Georgia Tech's run defense is near the bottom of the country. It's kind of funny that Ole Miss right now is kind of, with its win over Tulane, holding the SEC's banner for best non-conference win in the early season. So I just think it's funny that Ole Miss, they're going to have wins over Georgia Tech and Tulane and kind of be right now holding two of the SEC's better non-conference wins if they get it done on Saturday.
I think Ole Miss wins big. I think their offense is really good this year. I think they'll score a lot of points and probably blow out Georgia Tech. All right, Arkansas-BYU on Saturday. The last line I saw for this game was Arkansas by about 8 or 9 points. So Vegas obviously likes the Razorbacks. It's a 6:30 kickoff on ESPN2. Both of these teams, as we mentioned, they're 2-0, but who have they really played? I mean, they've beaten FCS teams and teams that are maybe just above FCS in caliber of quality. Scotty, what have you got?
Yeah, I like Arkansas. I'd mentioned KJ earlier in the pod, and I just think this is a week that you see KJ kind of carry this team. I'm not exactly sure of a score right now. Like in my mind, I've got something like 28-17 or 31-17. Something like that. So maybe we do see Cam Little if it is 31-17. It's been weird not seeing him on the field like at all other than PATs. But yeah, I just think it's a week that we see KJ, take firm control of this team. If he, that's not to say that he hasn't already this season, but you see more of him. I think maybe more of his complete game. And we see Arkansas's defensive line. We'll see if it's for real. I think they'll get some pressure on Keaton Slovis and knock him off his spot enough to make him make some mistakes.
Yeah, I'm with you, Scotty. I don't think it'll be the same type of game that we saw last year where it's a shootout by any stretch of the imagination. I think that it's going to be a little bit lower scoring. I'll pick Arkansas by something in the like 24 to 10 range or something like that. I'm just not sold on BYU's offense at all. And I think that Arkansas, just playing at home and at night, I think that they'll be able to get it done in this one.
Yeah, I think home game and quarterback is what it comes down to for me. I think that Jefferson is a better quarterback than Slovis is. And, what we saw him do against BYU last year probably is a pretty good indication that he's going to be able to do some similar things this year. I know they brought in a new defensive coordinator. Maybe it's not as high scoring of a game as it was last year, but I think that they've kind of had the reins on KJ Jefferson the first 2 weeks. I think the reins come off this week. He runs however many times he needs to make this offense click. And, even with the questions for Arkansas along the offensive line, I think that, if last year's any indication, they're going to be able to have some success physically against BYU. I know they didn't have it against Western Carolina or Kent State necessarily, but I don't know. I've got a feeling that they're going to be able to have a better week this week along the offensive line. They've got the same group playing together for the second consecutive week. They didn't have that last week, and by all the indications, it's been a lot of really physical practices. There's been some manhood, I think, that's been challenged this week on Arkansas's football team, and I think they'll respond Saturday night. I think they'll beat BYU. Couldn't give you a score. I just think that they'll come out on top. Again, Arkansas-BYU, 6:30 Saturday night on ESPN2. Hope you'll come to our website, wholehogsports.com, after the game to read all of our coverage. And we'll be back next week with another Whole Hog Football podcast to talk about that game and start looking ahead to the Razorbacks and LSU. For Ethan Westerman and Scotty Bordelon, I'm Matt Jones. We appreciate you joining us, and we'll see you next time on the Whole Hog Football Podcast.
The proceeding has been a production of the Hog Sports Network. Look for our daily podcasts on Apple, Spotify, or your favorite podcast platform. For more Razorbacks coverage, go to wholehogsports.com or follow the Hog Sports Network reporters on social media.